Welcome. This presentation is going to be about customizing the 7 Web using SoArchiveControl and providers. My name is Arild, and I'm working in a company called Omer, which is stationed in Oslo. Most of us who's working in the company has been working with SuperOffice for around 15 years, so we have been doing a lot of different stuff with this program. My agenda today is, first of all, to talk about the SoArchiveProvider. And we're going to see how we can create our own provider from scratch in Visual Studio. So there's going to be a lot of coding in this session. Next, I'm going to talk about the ArchiveProvider and NetServer. We're going to see some example of how we can use the provider we created in NetServer. Third, we're going to look at how we can use the provider we created inside 7 Web using the SoArchiveControl, which is available there. And if we have the time at the end of the session, I will go through 3 small things called column selections, link hints, and dynamic filter. I will get back to those later in the session. If you have any questions, just stop me on the way. If I'm talking too loud, too small, too fast, too light. Okay, Tony, I know, we have to clean your ear, know that? Yeah. So just tell me. So, what's in it for me, or what's in it for you with this presentation? My wish or hope for this session is that when this is finished, you will be able to create your own provider using the interfaces found in NetServer. Further, it will be how you can use that provider from NetServer, because ArchiveProvider is actually not a 7 Web provider, it's a NetServer provider, and you don't need to use 7 Web for using that. So I'm going to show you an example how we can use that provider in a console application, for example. And least but not very important thing is how can you use the provider inside 7 Web, using how you have to configure all the different config files in 7 Web to use the provider we created. I have a couple of times got the question, why should we use archive providers? Why not use an external website and web panels in SuperOffice and HTML site or something like that? And the main reason, if you're asking me, is that using the archive provider and found in NetServer and 7 Web, you get the SuperOffice look and feel for everything for free. You don't have to implement it in your own solution, you have it out of the box. You're also getting a lot of functionality. You have already tried many times, both in the Windows and the web. You can click on a column to get sorting. You have the possibility to, for the user to select which column you want to show in the GUI. And you also have like something called dynamic filtering. You have much functionality out of the box without any coding, or very little coding at all. And of course, you don't need an external website or maybe a third-party software to do this compared to using a web panel inside SuperOffice. A little bit about prerequisites. What I'm going to create here today is, as I told, an archive provider and an archive control, and I'm using the standard 7 Web installation. The database is empty. All I added a couple of contacts, nothing more than that. For my external data source, I'm using the AdventureWorks database, which is the demo database for SQL Server 2008. It's free of charge and it's downloadable from Microsoft.com. This could, of course, be a web service, could be an Excel file, could be a text file, could be whatever you want. But for this demo, I'm using the AdventureWorks database. We're going to work with 3 definitions that you may or may not have heard before. Just one question. How many of you have been working with archive providers before in 7 Web? 1? Okay. We have 3 definitions. That columns, rows, and entities. I assume all of you know what columns and rows is. That's the same thing you have in Excel. You have rows and you have columns. Entities is, for me, something which I will call a row type. If I switch to the 7 Web, you can see in the Activities tab, I have here 3 records. And down on the right, I can remove the documents, and I can remove the follow-ups. Okay. And I can turn it on again and see and select what kind of data I want into this tab. The documents and the follow-ups are what we call entities. And you see here I have, for the entity follow-ups, I have 2 meetings. So it's row of the same type, to say it easy. In my demo, I'm going to use only 1 entity to make it simple at this, but you can have almost as many entities you want. But that's up to you to decide. I'm going to do this coding in C#. You can, of course, do it in VB. I'm using both languages when I'm programming, depending on the customers and what I'm going to create. I recommend using C# when creating archive providers because the C# has a keyword called yield, which you don't have in VB. And the yield keyword is used when handling and working with enumerables. And we're going to see that in the code example, how that's used. I haven't found the solution for that keyword in VB, but I'm sure it's doable, but I haven't had the time to figure it out. So even if I'm working with the VB project, I'm creating my archive providers as a separate component using C#, because I think that's easier. You're also going to see some link to SQL code. I don't know if you have used that before, but if you can read simple SQL statements, that shouldn't be too difficult to read. And I used only to get the data out of my external data source. So it's not important in this demo, but it is there. Okay. SoArchiveProvider. 6 months ago, we got a new employee in my company, and he asked me about what is an archive provider. He was new to SuperOffice and haven't been into this before. And I was like trying to find a good sentence for what an archive provider is. And I found one actually in the help file of SuperOffice. And as you can see, I wrote that to translate from a highly normalized database to a flat data model suitable for multi-column lists and reports. I think that's a very good definition of what an archive provider is. It can, of course, do much, much more than this, but if it comes down to one sentence, I think this is it. As you maybe already know, if you've been to Marek's pre-sessions, earlier expandables, you know that an archive provider is extensible, it's searchable, it has support for paging, for restrictions. There's a lot of functionality inside the provider which you can use when you're creating your own. As I told before, it's a NetServer component. It knows nothing about 7 or 6 Web for that matter. And there are several built-in types which inherit from the base class we're going to use today that save you for a lot of coding. And the rule is, unwritten rule, is that if you're going to create a provider which is using table inside the SuperOffice database, you don't use the base class that we're going to use today. You use one of the internal classes from the NetServer, which is saving you for a lot of work. If you have your own user-defined tables you want to create an archive provider for, you can actually download a code generator from the beta site or from DevNet, which generate everything for you. You just open the program, you select the tables you want to create a provider for, and press generate, and then you get 98% of the code out of the box. Tony is the creator of that program, actually. For external data that I'm going to use today, I recommend using the ArchiveProvider. Using that one gives you the most flexibility, most functionality out of the in it, and you have, but it's a lot of programming, or it's quite more programming compared to using the built-in or the code generator. Okay. The ArchiveProvider we're going to use today is built up of 3 sub-interfaces. Or the interface we're going to implement today is built up of 3 sub-interfaces. It is the ArchiveProvider has row interfaces, which is handling the rows. You have the ArchiveProvider has columns, which is handling everything that has to do with the columns in my provider. And you have the ArchiveProvider has entity, which is handling the entities. Just quick, this is the tables of the AdventureWorks database I'm going to use. The AdventureWorks database is a very big database, and I'm going to use 3 of those tables. The contact ID I'm going to get direct from SuperOffice, and say that the contact ID found in the AdventureWorks is the same ID that's in SuperOffice in this demo, just to make it simple and straightforward. The result that I want to do today is to create a new page in the contact main window. Sorry, a new tab, not new page, new tab, where I have an archive control populating data from my provider. So the difference between the provider is that the provider is getting the data from the database. The archive control is a control in 7 Web, like that you have a text box control, you have a label control, everything, and that control is using the provider. Okay, demo. Any questions? Everything is clear? Okay. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch to Visual Studio, and I created myself a class library project. I have set up config file for using my database on my local machine. I have an entity, which is just a place where I can put some data. There's no logic in here, it's just a placeholder for data. And since I'm using link to SQL, I have something called DB classes DBML, which is the connection to my database. This could of course be a web service or a text file or whatever. That's up to you to define. In my case, I'm using this database. Okay, the first thing I need to do is, of course, to create a class that's going to be my provider. So add class. Now I'm going to look into this, so don't forget the naming of the class. I call this AdventureWorks order archive.cs. Okay, the first thing I have to do is of course making sure the references, all the NetServer references are in my solution or in my project. And then I need to import that from the archive list, where everything I need creating myself an archive provider is found in there. Next, I need to tell which class or which interface I'm going to implement, and that's going to be a ArchiveProvider. And as always, when you're creating a plugin in SuperOffice, you need to set the class attribute so that the logic inside NetServer knows that this is an archive provider. And the name of that attribute is ArchiveProvider. It has two methods, which is the provider name, or the name of the archive provider, and priority. I call the name provider name, which is a variable I'm going to declare inside the class. I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes. Do you know about the priority, how that is working inside NetServer? It is so if you have two components, two providers, or whatever, two plugins with the same name and the same type, NetServer has to decide which plugin to use. And it using the priority to decide which is going to win. And the plugin with the lowest priority is going to win. And every plugin in SuperOffice, if you're creating a new replacement provider for one of the providers inside SuperOffice, as long as you're setting a lower priority than that provider has, your provider will be used instead. And the default value for SuperOffice's provider is int max divided by 2. So what I now can do, if I create my second provider, I can, of course, as long as I set, or you created the same provider with the same name as I have, as long as you set the smaller value than int max value divided by 2, your provider will win over the provider I'm creating here, if both is installed on the same NetServer or on the same 7 Web. Okay, then I need to some class variables and stuff, so I'm cheating. I have created a lot of snippets, which I got all those all the code. I'm very fast writing. I'm just going to go through what is here. The first line is just a connection to my external data source, which is going to be the AdventureWorks database. And this has something to do with the link to SQL statement and everything, so I'm not going to go into details here. Next, I have a constant defining the provider name, which is the AdventureWorks order. That's the name of my provider. It's not the name that's going to be visible in 7 Web, but it's the programming name I'm going to use as a programmer and when I'm configuring the 7 Web later on. For the same thing, I have an entity name. This is the programming name of the entity, and not the name that you're seeing down here, because this is a display name and not the program name we are working with. But I have a programming name which I'm using in my code, and what we're going to use inside the config files. Further, I'm using two helper classes which is available inside the NetServer. And that is the column helper. Column helper, oh sorry, that's actually this. Column helper is an object or class which has a functionality for handling everything that has to do with columns. It knows which columns the user of my provider wants to see, and it knows what kind of columns my provider supports. I'm going to show you a little bit later, just in a few minutes, but the column helper also is using reflection to scan my classes, my provider, for columns, to see which column is this provider supporting. And if you see a little bit down here in the constructor, you see I'm creating a new instance of the column helper and I'm sending in my class. And since I'm sending in my instance for my provider, the column helper can use reflection to find which column I have defined inside this provider. I haven't defined the column yet. It's going to come on in a couple of minutes. As we have a column helper, we also have an entity helper, which does the same thing as the column helper does for columns. It knows which entities the user of my provider wants. In other words, it knows which of these the user has clicked in 7 Web. The same thing, the entity helper can tell the user which entities my provider supports. And if you, we can take that a little bit. Further, I have a couple of variables, page number, page size, which is used for handling paging. You don't have to support paging, but that's up to you to decide, and not the user, but it's up to you. We have restrictions support in the provider, which means that the user can tell my provider use those restrictions. And in my demo solution here, I'm going to support only one restriction, and that's the contact ID. I'm expecting that the user is telling me for which contact IDs you want me to show the orders for. And last, we need a variable for handling order bys. This is an array of archive order by info objects, and the user has the ability to set one or more order bys, both extending or descending the side of each order by. In the constructor, we talked about the column helper. We created a new instance of the entity helper, and the entity helper is not using any reflections, so we had to call the add available entities method to add a new archive row type info. And in the constructor here, you have to specify the entity name, which is the programmatic name we're going to use when programming or defining or configuring 7 Web to use this provider. It also has a display name, which in 7 Web will be equal to what the user is seeing down here. You can define if this is going to be optional or not. If you set this to false, this entity will always be used. And the user of the provider can't decide and tell if he wants it or not. If it's false, it will always be a part of the result that the provider is returning. And when this is false, the checkbox will not be available here. So if the documents if the document entity for the activities provider was set to false in the code, this checkbox would be invisible. And the last parameter which I forgot is, as long as this is optional, I can tell the user that this entity should default be set on or off. As I'm telling you this is true, then the checkbox is going to be automatically set on when I'm displaying this in 7 Web. Okay, questions? Is it understandable, or going too fast forward, or is it too slow? Or?
It's okay.
It's okay, great. Now I'm going to start to implement one of the first sub-interfaces we saw earlier in the PowerPoint, and that is the has entities interface. And again, I have everything made in here, has entities. There are two methods available, and two methods that you need to implement. That's the get available entities and the set desired entities. When the 7 Web is wondering what kind of entities does your provider support, it actually calls the get available entities and asking my provider, hey, which entities does you support? And since I'm using the entity helper, all I have to do is send that request to the helper, and that handles everything for me. So it's one line of code, then this is out of the way. The same thing with the set desired entity. This is called by 7 Web to tell me which entity the user wants to use in my provider. Again, I'm rerouting this to my helper classes, and I forget about it. The helper class is handling everything correctly. Next, we're going to implement the has columns interface. And again, it's much of the same. get available columns is when the user of my provider wants to know what kind of columns does my provider support. Set aside columns when the user tells me use this and this and this and this columns. I'm not sure if you have seen it, but especially in 6 Web you can let the user decide by going in here and configure columns. And then you can remove and add columns as you want. And when the user is doing this, the 7 Web is telling my provider, for this user and this provider, use this and this and these columns. And another user can use a different set of columns. And we will come back to how we can use this dialog when we're going to configure the 7 Web. The third method we need to implement is to set order by. And this, as I told earlier, this is an area of archive order by info objects that are coming in. So I'm just taking care of that. I'm just saving it in a private variable I have. Then is an important method which is called set restriction. This is the way the user of my provider is telling me which restriction should I use in this query. Remember that the provider is almost like fire and forget. The user of my provider is creating an instance of the provider I'm creating, telling me use this in this column, use this in this sorting, this is the criteria or restriction you're going to use. Please give me the data. And when my provider is finished and the clients tell, oh, I'm finished getting data, I'm calling close to clean up, then everything is deleted from the memory. And next time the same user is trying to get the same data, everything is started over again. A new instance is created, there is information about what entity, what columns the user wants. So it's like if one time running, then everything is deleted from memory. Okay, set restriction, what I'm doing here is that I'm checking if the user of my provider has has specified a contact ID restriction which I'm supporting. And if I can find that in the restrictions that is coming to this method, I'm reading out the value and saving it. And as a provider has the possibility to be extendable, which means that the restrictions you're getting in here could be much more than maybe you expect. I could get an array of 10 restrictions here, but I only care about the one I want to use that my provider supports. And as long as I'm handling one or more of those restrictions, I need to return true out of this method to tell the base class and the interface and NetServer that I'm handling at least one restriction which is in the array that's passed to this method. If I'm not using any one, I'm just returning false. The fine thing with the thing I'm going to know is that this is plumbing. If you have done this once, you can copy this the next time you want to create a new provider. You can use almost the same code. Of course, you maybe have different restrictions, but everything else can you reuse for your next provider and for a third and a fourth and fifth provider you're creating. So this is like most likely is one-time programming. Okay, now I have defined 2 of the 3 interfaces. So now it's time for telling or defining the columns that my provider supports. There I have my column definitions. I'm using constants for the program names I'm using for my columns, and that's since I'm using the same programmatic names when handling sorting, so that you don't have to do that, but I'm doing that here. The most important thing is down here. Here I'm creating a new column which has the programmatic name of sale order ID. That's the constant I'm using. It has a display name called sale number, which is the text that will be visible inside 7 Web in the SoArchiveControl. I have a tooltip. So when the user is holding the mouse pointer over the row, over the column header, you will see a tooltip with a description of what this column is showing, what kind of data is it showing. I have a data type. Could be int, could be date time, could be decimal, could be string, could be different things. Images. Here I have a parameter defining if this column is sortable or not. Can the user click in the header or tell my provider I want to sort the data using this column or not? True and false. Next, is it visible or not? Sometimes you need an ID column which should be a part of your return data but shouldn't be visible to the user. Typical primary keys or that kind of stuff. You don't want to show to the user, but you need it if you're going to like double click on the row or whatever you're going to do. And finally, we define a default width. We have constant, which is defining the default width depending on the data type. Default number width, default date time width, decimal width, string width, like that. When you're naming your variables for your columns, it's very important that you start the naming with _call. Because, as I told you earlier, the column helper is using restrictions to go through my object or my class to see which columns I have in my provider. It's looking for variables of type archive column info starting with the name _call. Does everyone know what reflection is? Yes? Great. So all I have to do is create my columns with the right beginning of the name, and I don't have to do more. So if I'm adding more and more columns later on, I don't have to tell my column helper this is the new columns map, because it's using reflection to do all that kind of stuff. Okay. Now I've done 2 out of 3 sub-interfaces. And now I'm going to start with the important one, which is the has rows interface. Like this. The first method is close. This is the cleanup method in your provider, and the user of your provider should always call close. So you can clean up, you can close your connection, you can close the file, whatever you have opening or resources you have open, you get the possibility to close before the object is killed from memory. The get result information is actually a new method in 7, which is giving you a possibility to return extended information from your provider. A typical usage would be the row count. So the client or the user of your provider can ask the information of get result information to get the number of rows found that your provider will return before it actually starts to get the raw data from your provider. You can call it the get result information. I'm not going to support this in my demo, so I'm just returning no. It's not supported. Don't have to implement it, but it is there if you want to. The get rows is the main method or the most important method in your archive provider. This is where you're going to execute the call to external data source, and where you're going to handle sorting, paging, and returning data to the use of your provider. I'm going to get back to this method in a minute. So for now, I'm just calling yield break to tell I'm returning nothing. Set paging info is the way for the user or the client of this provider to tell me what paging do we want to show. is the first page, the second page, and how many rows is a page. If you have seen, well, I haven't got enough data, but if you have seen in both 6 and 7 Web, when you're starting to scroll down, it's suddenly fetching more and more rows, depending on how far you are. And if you have like 1,000 activities, it don't fetches all at once. It's fetching the first 50 rows, and when you're scrolling down, it's starting to fetch 50 more, and then 50 more, and 50 more. And what it does is actually telling me that the page, number of rows there's on the page is 50, which is default in both 6 and 7 Web, and what page the user wants to see, starting by 0. So on the first page you will return, if you like have a result returning 200 rows, you will return the row 1 to 50. And when this coming back, hey, show me page 1. It's like from 51 to 100, and when it's telling me show page 2, it's from 100 to 150, because it starts at 0. Okay, now I'm going to start with the most important method, and that's get rows. What I could have done, or what I should have done now, was that I would save everything I have here, and save it on a safe place on my computer, and the next time I'm going to create a new provider, I use this as a base. All I have to implement then is new column definitions, and of course I need to tell the name of my entity and provider, and then I have to implement the get rows. So I'm going to implement this now, and again I'm writing very fast. And since the get rows is returning an enumerable of archive rows, I'm creating myself a list of archive rows objects. And then I'm calling a method which I haven't implemented yet. It's calling get data from AdventureWorks, which will execute the query against my external data source, get the result back, and do what it's going to do, add that data to the rows list I have created, and come back to the get rows method. When I got all the data from my external data source, I have to call, since I'm supporting sorting, the sort archive row, which is also a method I have to implement, because you have to implement the sorting mechanism, and you have to implement the mechanism for getting data from the data source, since NetServer doesn't know where data is coming from. And when I have got the data is sorted, I returning the data using this method here. First, I calculate the index in the list I should start on. If I'm on page, the first page, which is page number 0, this will end up 0, so the index in the list would start at 0. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when the users go, the user of my provider is coming back and telling me, hey, I want to start from page 1, because the user maybe scrolled down in 7 Web. I know the page size is 50, because that's what the user of my provider is telling me, and it's telling me that they're going to start at page 1. Then I know I got to start at row 50 returning data. And what you're seeing here is that every time I'm actually getting all the data from my data source, but I'm returning only the 50 rows at once. And of course you can add some more logic to handle that, so you get small amount of data from external data source, but that depends on how much data you're getting, what is your data source, what's the performance. If it's over a very slow internet connection, maybe you should think different than if you have everything on the server like I have in SQL Server. And there you use the yield return. method. I'm not going into this in C#. You can read about it both on the internet, in Google, and in the help file. And what it does is return one row, one archive row to the user. Okay, now I'm finished implementing the 3 interfaces I have. And now it's time to implement the get data from AdventureWorks, which is getting data from my external data source, and the sort archive row method to sort the data. And again, I have everything written before. And here is the method called get data from AdventureWorks. I'm getting the list of rows in. And the first thing I'm checking for is the entity, is the type of data that this method is actually returning, is that desired from the user of my provider? Because if the user removing all the checkboxes, that my provider supports, there's no data I should return because the user don't want my data. And okay, they want my entities. So the next I'm doing is I'm getting the data from the data source. I can go quickly into this method, and you will see all I'm doing is I'm using a link to SQL statement, select, from, join, where. There is my restriction. I'm going to show you. Leave it up here. Let me see. Here I'm calling the get order data. There is the restriction I got from the user of my provider. And I'm passing it directly down to the external database in this demo case. And then what I'm doing, I'm creating a new AdventureWorks order entity just to hold my data, adding it to a list, and returning the data. So the data I'm getting from my external data source is a list of AdventureWorks order entities. Then I'll do some checking to see if I'm getting actually some data in return. What I can do now, I can do like this. Get some data in return. And I'm looping through that list using the for each method. And the important thing to do now is to create a new archive row, because that's what the get rows method is going to return. It's going to return a list or archive rows objects. And for each archive row I'm creating, I have to specify which entity these rows belongs to. Is it the document? Is it the follow-ups? Is it the sales? I don't have sales anymore, but we have it in 6. In my case, it's my entity. If you have support several entities, maybe you have some data from the AdventureWorks, and maybe you have data from an web service. In this method, I want to make sure that these rows are marked as the AdventureWorks entity. And we'll create another method where the entity name would maybe be your web service if you have that as well, if you know what I mean. Next, I need to check if the user actually wants, what kind of information the user wants. What kind of columns does the user want in return? Maybe it wants the order ID, maybe it wants the sale quantity. I don't know. I have to ask, since the user can specify that and tell me what it wants. And if the user wants call sale order ID, okay, then I take the row object, I add the column with the name and with the data. All the data is returned is a string. So you can format it as you want and everything. Even if I told earlier that this column is a decimal or is a date or something, in the archive row you can return it as a string and format it if you want to do that. So I'm going to do that for each column. I have the sale order ID, I have a quantity, I have an order date, unit price, line total, product number, or product name. And I add that to the rows, which is the incoming list of archive rows, which again is what is returned here and up to the user of my provider. Okay, then we finish with this. The next one is the sorting, and the sorting is actually not very special for this provider. So I'm not going to go into detail how I sort my data, because that's up to you how to decide. Do you want to send that to the SQL server and use order by statement, or how you want to do it? That's up to you to decide. But what I want to show here is the order by, so the restrictions that are specified by the user is an area of archive restriction info objects. And the first thing I do is I'm testing if are there any restrictions set by the user of my provider. Okay, yes there is. And I am only supporting one restriction, so I'm testing on the name. And in the name field I'm getting the column name. And depending on what column, if you look at which column the user clicks here, I will get the program name for that column to my provider, and I'm sorting the column correctly depending on what the user decides. Okay, and what I'm doing here is I need like that. I'm missing a using statement. Just short here, I'm using the cultured data formatter, which is an object found inside SuperOffice for helping you to format data correctly, both decimal and date-time data, depending on the settings on the browser and that kind of stuff. Okay, now I'm actually finished programming the archive provider from scratch. I've implemented all interfaces, all methods that need to be done. I'm supporting paging, I'm supporting sorting, and I'm returning data from the provider. So what I can do now, I can just build and see everything is building successfully. Questions? Is it difficult? No? I have to say, the first time you are doing this, it could be a little bit overwhelming, but when I've done it like 2 or 3 times, it's actually quite easy. Okay, next I'm going to talk about is how we can use this provider from NetServer. Because one of the fine things with the archive provider is that now I have encapsulated my data source from the source, or my data from the data source. So if I'm getting the data from a web service, I can now use the provider and don't care about where the data is coming from. I can tell my provider, I want this and this and this data back, and here's the restriction. Give me the data. I don't care where we're getting the data from. All I know, my provider, this provider returning this information. And when you're going to use this from your code, this could be from a Windows application, this could be from a web application, it could be from a console application, it could be whatever. As long as you're using NetServer, you can use the provider you create. And when you're doing that, there's 5 things you need to have in mind, and 5 things you have to do. The first, of course, is to create an instance to your provider. And you do that by calling the archive provider factory method, or object inside the NetServer. And then it creates an instance of the provider it wants. We're going to see an example of this. Second, you can, that's optional, but you can ask the provider, what kind of information do you support? What columns, what entities, what do you support? What can you give me? What information can you give me? Then you need to tell the provider, what information do you want? What do you want it to do? I want this information, I want sales order, I want sales quantity, and I want it for contact ID 5. And next, you have to fetch the data using an iteration. in other words, using for each, and call the get rows method in the for each to get the data. When you're finished, you're calling the close, and then you have your data. So, back to my solution. So what I'm doing now is I'm adding a new project, which is a console application. I'll just call it console application 3, like this. I, of course, need to add references, both to NetServer components and my archive provider I'm going to use. So, of course, it's a project. I'm going to add references to, let me see, I need the SO license, SO plugins you always need, SO database, and for, I don't know why, but you need the SO CRM web, I'm not sure why, and the SO code DLL. I also know for some reason that I need to have the system identity model, which is a .NET component, so I have to add that as well. Okay. Yeah, so, something like that. Next, of course, as long as I'm using NetServer, I need an app config, and it's here. And again, let me see code. Oh, everything is hanging. Oh, how fun. Waiting to pause to complete it. Oh, okay, that was. You see, assuming this is I'm using something called ReSharper, which is probably going in the background and doing stuff. But again, I have everything handled, so here is my app config. And this is a standard NetServer configuration file. It's one thing you need to remember, besides setting up to the correct database and everything. And that's going to be, oh sorry, that's the wrong, find dynamic, it's dynamic load. And of course here you need to add your component. In other words, my provider has to be added to the dynamic load. You don't have to do that if you're using this as a part of 7 Web or 6 Web, but if you're using it as in NetServer, you have to add it. Okay. Now I can go in here and I can add my code, and again I have everything here. And of course I need to add the interface, archive list. And here's the whole code I need to use my provider I've just created. First of all, I need, of course, to log into SuperOffice and also log into NetServer. The first step in the 5-step we went through in the PowerPoint was to create an instance of your provider using the ArchiveProvider factory. And that's what I'm doing here. And if you see, the name here is the same name I specified in my provider here. That's the name of the provider. Then I don't care about, since I know what this provider is already returning, I don't care about asking it what information do you have. So I'm telling it I want sale order ID, order date, unit price, and product name. And I want to use the adventure orders entity, and if you can see, this is the same I have here. And the column names, which I have defined as a constant, is here. Then I'm saying this is the paging. I want to return all rows. I don't care about paging. Give me all the data at once. And finally, I'm adding a restriction where I'm telling I want all the orders information, those columns are specified for contact equals 5. Then I'm using the for each to loop through the data. Now the get rows is called, The data is executed, the SQL is going to the external data source, getting the data. I haven't done anything sorting because I haven't specified any sorting, and then it's returned to me. I'm writing that to the console. I'm closing my provider, I'm closing my session, and I'm waiting for the user to press enter. Oh, of course I need to set this as set a starter project. Oh, yes. Let's see. It's one of the references I'm missing. Didn't I got the Seven Web? I had that yesterday, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me look in the papers. SoCore, SoCRM, SO database, SuperOffice plugins, SO licenses. I have all the.
Take them all.
Yeah, take them all. Let's see what it could be. Not super license. Oh, all I did yesterday was to add the SoCRM Web. Of course, this is a demo ghost is coming. Yeah, that means it was true an exception. Well, if it's not working, you have to believe my word. I can try to. SoCore, SO database, my provider. That should be all. SoCore, SoCRM Web, SO database, SuperOffice plugins.
What about SO license?
Ah, this is there. SuperOffice plugins. Oh. Yeah, but it shouldn't be. That's all I've done all the other times. I can see if what I can do. Let me see here. What I can do. Open folder Windows Explorer. Control application 2. I can take the bin debug and do like this. This is the same code I used it earlier. So this is the same code I have, and I just built it yesterday. And as you can see, I'm getting all the data out here. This is the data return from my provider. And the fine thing is, I'm accessing my provider as it was like a SQL database. Specify restriction in the columns. But I don't care if it's coming from an Excel file or internet or from the space or whatever it's coming from. I don't care about that.
And how do you show it, how you add it in the web?
Yes, now is the time to see how can we use this provider in 7 Web.
Shouldn't it be possible to run it in Windows, SuperOffice Windows? 7?
Yes, in the 7 you can do that actually, yes. That's a new feature. You can have, the meaning for, the reason I'm showing you this is that it doesn't care where you're running it. You can use it in an exe file, a Windows program, a web program, a console application or whatever. As long as you have support for NetServer and using the .NET framework, you can use it as ever you want. No, what I'm not going to show you, I'm going to go back to this one. Oh, of course, this has been. Come on. There we got it. Is the SoArchiveControl. And the SoArchiveControl is a control in SuperOffice 7 and 6 Web, which you can, is like equal to a text box or label. But this control is made specifically for using providers and support the functionality that's found inside the provider. And the fine thing with that control is also giving you a lot of free functionality. It has support for menus. It has toolbars. You have seen that in 7 you got the export button, which is found in the control. You have something called dynamic filtering, which is giving the user the possibility to specify a filter directly in the GUI. I'm going to show you. Come on. You see up here you have a little bit icon here. When you're clicking that one, you can specify criteria, contact. I don't have much data, so I can't. You can see there was a lot of. You can see there gray fields where the user can actually enter data. A filter. I want to filter the data down if you like a huge list. And you get that for free. You have to do some small changes to your provider to support this, but it's pretty easy to do. And if you have the time, then I'm going to show you how to do it. If not, it will be part of the example code I'm putting up, giving to Tony. So, back to Visual Studio again. What I've done earlier is I prepared the config files. I've just created a link to the config files I'm going to use. As you already know, there are a few of them, and it could be time-consuming finding the correct file. The first thing we need to do is to go into a config file called SoArchiveColumn lists. And the reason for that is that we need to tell 7 Web what columns my provider supports. It's a little bit unlogic since 7 Web could ask my provider and get that information. But there is a reason for that. So again, I'm going to add the columns I have in my provider. At the top, we specify, of course it's an archive, we specify a provider name, which is the name we used inside the archive provider, Adventure Works Order. We are also giving it a GUI name. And the reason for that is that one provider can be used with different set of columns. If you see below, we specify which columns we want to use from this provider. And we also specified if it's mandatory, if it's a default or not column, or if it should be ignored. That has to do with when it's going to be visible in or displayed in 7 Web. If you set like mandatory to true, the user can't remove that column from the GUI. It has to be there all the time. If it's mandatory false, the user can select if it wants to have it or not. The same thing, setting it to ignore, means that the column is going to be ignored and not visible at all, but it's going to be put in the control but not visible. And here you have the GUI name, because you can use the same provider with different column definition or column setup, different places around in 7 Web. So in this demo, I'm just calling the same name as the provider name, but I'm adding the word archive at the end, just to make it simple. And what I want to do is to add a new tab here at the end, where I'm going to show the order data from my external data source. So what I have to do then is go to the SO contact panel config and go look. I'm going to collapse all those views. You see here all those views. Sorry. Each of those views is the same as the tabs you're seeing here. So what I need to do is to create a new view in this file. Contact panel, like this, where I'm telling that, okay, this is the name of the view, the type is SO view, and we have SO protocol. This is standard 7 Web features, if you have been into that. I'm giving it a caption. This is the caption of the tab I'm getting. Then I'm adding controls to this view, and here you see I'm adding a control called Adventure Order Archive of type SoArchiveControl. If you have been working with these config files, you could of course add SO textbox, SO label, SO checkbox, date controls, whatever. But I'm using the SoArchiveControl. Next, I'm specifying the provider name, which is the name of my provider we created. The same name we have inside the provider. The control also need a data source for getting the column information from the config file. For some reason, the control don't ask my provider for this information. It's going to the config file, to the SoArchive columnist config file, to find that information. And to be able to do that, we need to specify a data handler, like this. The data handlers will always be archive column config data handler. That's default. But you're specifying what kind of call it entity or what kind of data you want in return, which GUI name you want in return. So you see here I specified that Adventure Works Order Archive, which is the same I'm specifying in the GUI name. So the combination of the provider name and the name here is giving me this. And as always, when we're using data handlers, have you been using data handlers in the config files at all in 7 Web, or are you new to this? Have you used it? Yeah. As always, when you're using data handlers, you have to go into the top of the page or a config file to add that to the top of the config file. And then I have to go to the SO contact page. You see here we have the data handler, archive column config data handler. And we need to add a section here, which is specifying which archive column info to use. I don't need to create this data handler. The data handler already exists in 7 Web. But I just need to specify which column information in the column list is going to use. And again, the GUI name and the provider name is specified. So I'm using that all over. Next, I'm specifying if I want to show the header in the control. You can select no headers. What about the toolbars? Do I want the toolbars? And do I want the export button, export to Excel button? And I can specify a default sort column. So by default, I'm sorting it to the sale order ID column. At the top, I'm specifying a restriction. And what I'm doing here is binding the contact ID restriction I know my provider support to the current contact in 7 Web. So when the user is switching contact in the contact window, I retrieve that ID and send that to the provider. Okay, then I need to save. Yes?
How can you specify that you want it sorted descending instead of ascending
as a default? I'm not sure. Maybe do something like this, or you have a property in the default sort we can specify. I haven't done it for a long time, but that's possible to specify, yes. And now this is it, if I'm not, let me see, yes. What I've done now, I added a new tab. I've added the SO Archive Control. I've specified in that control use my provider. And all I have to do now is refresh. I'm getting the new tab. Remember, if the caching is turned on in the config file, you have to do a flush. That's question flush behind in the HTTP address at the end. Now I can click it. there I'm getting the data. And if you see, if I'm scrolling down, then I'm getting the next page. I'm scrolling further down, I'm getting the third page. And then at the end. If I'm removing my entity adventure order, there's no data. Because, okay, you don't want my entity, I don't return any data. And now I got all the data from my external data source through my provider into 7 Web. And I use the same provider in my Windows application somewhere else, or in my code behind, or whatever you want to use it. You can use this when programming at all, just to get the data from external source.
What happens when you click on the link?
On the row? Yes, you're a little bit ahead of my schedule. I don't think there's some more time left, but if you want to see, I can just continue. This demo, if we have the time, I'm going to go through 3 things. Archive column selection dialog, which as you showed you earlier, that you give the user a possibility to choose which columns and the order bys and everything. It's giving a lot of free information. You have the link hints, and link hints is used when you want to handle the click. What's going to happen when the user is clicking the rows. And if you have several entities, you can have different link hints for each entity. So when you're double clicking on the document row in the activity list, you're getting the document dialog. If you're double clicking in appointment, you're getting the appointment dialog. And the same thing can be done. And of course, at the end, but I don't think I have the time for that, there's dynamic filter. So I can start with the link hint if that's what you want to see. And what I have to do then is to first go into our provider and specify the link hint. So what I'm doing is I'm going down here. No, sorry. Get rows. Here I'm creating the row that's returned to the user. And what I'm doing now is well, I don't have it here, that's nice. Add link hint. What you do here is that you specify ID equals like this. I think I have to use that. If I'm not sure, you specify. Have you used currents in 7 Web? Have you used that? No. When you're going to use link hints, you have to specify what we call a current. You have to go into the application configuration and down here you have the currents, which is a placeholder for your current. It's call it like a placeholder for my primary key in this case. This is where I'm going to, when the user clicks the row, I'm going to store the sale order ID in the current. Well, yeah, it's session to session. It's not a session, but it's always there. So it stores in a global place. So you can put it there, and you can go to another page, and you can get the same data. When I'm getting, if you want in 7.6 Web get the active contact ID, you're actually getting that from the current system inside the web. What I also need to do is to go into the file called SoArchiveControl link info types and add, let's see here. Add this. I need to specify a link info, and that's one what's going to happen when the user is clicking, or in my case, double clicking. So I'm creating, of course, a type, which it can be whatever you want. That's my name for this. And in this case, I'm creating a URL. Oh, sorry, an alert message box, just to see that I'm getting the value out of the current. So what I'm seeing here is that the current name I'm using is actually, Adventure Orders. That's the current name, and that's the name I'm using here. And all currents has automatically three properties. It's an ID, which is an integer value. It's a name, which is a text, and a type. And you as a programmer specify what the ID is, what the name is, and what the type is. So if you maybe you want to add the date into the current, you use the name property. Like I'm going to use the order ID, I'm using the ID property. So I'm going back to my here, and it's quite strange that I didn't have put this into sorting use provider. Okay. So what then I have to do is to add the link info type I'm going to use. And I can't call this order ID since I'm using the provider called Adventure Orders. Like this. And then I'm going to specify just be string. Okay. What's wrong here? Okay, what I can do is it's not as good coding, but I'm doing it anyway. I'm going to do adventure.
But the 2 should be a 1.
Yeah, I'm doing like this. It's not as nice to look at, but it should work like this. I need that. Now I specify the link int. I have to use the keyword nav for navigation, and then I use the name of the SoArchiveControl link info type, which is specified in the link info type config file. And then I specify the parameter of the current, which is going to be sale order ID. Then I have to build, and I have to rerun and see what's happening. I hope I've done it right.
Is it possible to get icons on the road?
Yes, you can get icons. Sometimes it's really slow when I'm pressing refire after building and I'm trying to reload the IIS. It's very slow for, I don't know why, but if it's not coming, I have to run the IIS reset. Yes, I forgot to mention, that was a very good question. What I have done to my solution is I have on my component is in the build events. In the post build, I'm actually copying the compiled DLL into the bin folder of the 7 Web. And if you're using a NetServer, of course, you're putting it in the same folder where you have the exe file or whatever. Thank you, I forgot that. That was a very good question. Okay, let's see if. Oh, there it is. Yeah, of course it's not working. Okay, yeah, of course. But this is the way of doing it. I've done something wrong here. I can find the code, and it will be, of course, in the demo code I'm giving it to you. But it's something like this, and you have to go on the control link info types and specify there. And yeah, it's too bad I didn't have it written in forehand. What I will show you, if you want to do, is how can I. If you see, if I right click on this, nothing is happening. But if I do the same thing in the activities, I'm getting a menu here. And I want that as well. I want to give the user possibility to choose which column he or she wants to have visible. And to do that, I need to go into the menu configuration and add, go just downstairs, so add the top should be fine. Like this, menu context archive. And the subcontext, always has to be context archive. Has to be that. The subcontext is a name that you're giving it. So I'm calling the name of the provider and header at the end. And here you see I have the archive sort config, column config, archive sort help, and archive column resize. That's the same menu you get when you're pressing the right button at the column in the other tabs. It's the same as this.
Do you know if it's the same thing for the Windows client?
The Windows client is a little bit different. I haven't tried it out, but I guess you would be able to do the same thing, but I can't guarantee that. So what I'm doing is, when the user is clicking it, I tell the system that it should call the Adventure Works Order Archive, which is the name of my provider, or name of my control, and it automatically add the archive control. And if you've been working with 7 Web, you know that when the 7 Web is rendering the pages, is depending on the control, it's adding things to the name, it's adding a lot of stuff to the controls. So I don't have to do anything about this. All I have to do is take the name and add archive control at the end, .org order by. And the same thing at the sort config, dialog open, archive configuration, that's standard, but I have to change the parameters. I have to set the provider name to the name of my provider. I have to set the GUI name, and I have to tell which control to refresh when the dialog is closing, because when you're closing the sorting dialog or the column definition dialog, there is executed a callback method, and the callback method to call when you're closing it are specifying here. All you have to do is specifying the provider name, and the rest of it is standard. You just add that to everyone. If you have a control called, sorry, not provider, the control name of the SoArchiveControl. If you have an archive control called SuperOffice, you change the name from here and let the archive control.refresh be there. The same thing with the column configuration. All you have to do is set the provider name, set the GUI name, and set the name of the control, SoArchiveControl, to refresh when the dialog is closing. Then I need to tell my archive Control is down here. To use which menu to use and when to use it. So what I'm doing is I'm going into this. I'm adding a menu element, but the context is always archive. The subcontext is AdventureWorks or the header, which is the same thing I did up here, the subcontext. So those two has to be unique in this file, and I'm specifying those here. I'm specifying the position, it's below cursor or above cursor or where the menu should appear, and when the menu should appear, and left click, right click, like that. That's all I have to do. What I can do now is go here, press F5, works audio. There we have the menu. I can take configure columns. I'm getting the dialog. Here's all the columns that my provider supports. Here's the column I have currently selected. I can add new columns. Yeah, that was already there. Sorry, total price, unit price. I press save. And my archive control here is refreshed, and the provider is called once more, and I got the new columns back. And I can, of course, clicking on it on sorting. And every time I'm clicking column header, it's getting a new call back to the provider. The data is got from the data source, from my external data source, then it's sorted, and then it's returned back again.
Can I ask a stupid question?
No stupid questions.
I mean, all the, can you show us that code again?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With all this config files and so on, and
Yeah.
this modification and so on. I mean, as a programmer, why I will use ArchiveProvider, why I will not use some web panel, some page, getting the database, get the information,
Yeah.
some GUI and so on. It's not the easier. I mean, with all respect, but all this.
The reason, as I mean, my answer to that is that the reason for using this is that, first of all, you're getting the SuperOffice look and feel.
I mean, it's very easy now with the Visual Studio. You get much
Yes.
stuff like with
Yes, but as I showed you here, it's the menu configuration here. Right menu, click on the header, column definition, sorting. I can go here and
Is it possible with a grid view sorting with me?
sure you can do that. Yeah, but you have to program it. You have to program it and support it and do it. Yeah. So that different approach.
I mean, why should I use all this coding and this config and get this information?
The reason
Why
that
not
is
use,
when they're doing changes in like going from 6 to 7, you have to rewrite and do a lot of stuff to get the GUI be nice for your web page. But when I'm using the archive control and my provider, I don't have to do anything. Maybe I have to add one or two small
so
things.
You use too much time for configuring or adding this configuration at this time. And
Yes.
That's too
Yes,
time.
for the 7 Web, yes, you have to do that. And then that's correct. There's a learning curve to learn to do that, yeah. But as the provider, you can use inside your code anywhere. You can be in the Windows Excel file for that matters. Yeah, not the control, but using the provider as I showed in the console application.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good way to distance your code from the source. So if you have like maybe 4 or 5 programs using the same source, you can, instead of programming all the logic into each and every program, you're programming against your provider, and that provider decides where to get the data from. Is it from a database, or maybe from a web service, or from an Excel file, or from Space or Moon or whatever. But I understand you about the config file, yes. Digging into 7 and programming 7 Web and create pages and panels and controls, it's not straightforward. It's a very steep learning curve. And what I would recommend to do is go into DevNet under library tutorials. There's one tutorial you should go through if this is what you want to do. That's the Twitter web client tutorial, which is like 16 movies made by Tony. Everything is going step by step, explaining what I have to do, which files I have to do, the stuff. Even what I've gone through today, he's explaining in much more detail, taking much more time than I have time to do here today. So I would recommend that. And if you also want to go deeper into the ArchiveProvider system and see how that is working, look up in the NetServer data IPL file and search for ArchiveProvider. You will find an article called ArchiveProvider in depth, which is written by Marek, who has created all this. It's very detailed, explaining how things is going on and interfaces and how this is working with extensions and a lot of stuff you can do here. But yes, it's true. Learning 6 web to program the way I showed you here with the SoArchiveControl, that's not what you do in 5 minutes. Yes. But it's giving you a very flexibility, and you're giving you can control very much. You can take part of the 7 web, and what we have done for customers is that we're taking control over the sale dialogue.
Actually, that's
And
what
do-
I tried once to get the document dialog and add some extra
Yes,
places.
you can do that.
Actually, I got the answer negative from Tony that that's standard. You can change
You can do a lot of things. What we have done, for example, is that we take control of the sale data handler, and every time the user is going into the sale dialog and writing something and pressing the save button, or it's getting data from the database, we are sniffing on this. And hey, here's the sale I want to do something with, and I can do it. So when the user maybe is adding a new sale, I can put some data in another table or whatever I'm going to have to use. You can do a lot. And
you can change the default.
yes, you can do a lot, yes. But you have to spend a lot of time learning it, and the curve is very, very steep. But yes, you can do. You can do exactly the same thing with this framework that they've done with 7 Web.
So that's mean it's not like it's not default. You can change some stuff from
You can do it, but you have to go into the config files. You have to know what you're doing. It's not like switching 2 parameters, then everything is just.
I crash it a lot of times.
Yeah, you have to use a lot of times. Okay, questions? No more questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope you learned something.